What's up, Beastcoast Pokemon? James Beck with Aaron Zhang here, and today we're going to go over, I guess, recent events that have happened in between the first Liverpool and Salt Lake City regionals towards today, and we're going to recap the format basically leading up towards the EUIC that is happening in a couple of days when this video is getting released. We're going to be talking about the meta currently and what we expect to do well.
Hey guys, Cybertron. Relax, I was just gonna get there. Anyway, as this little buddy was saying, 80% of you aren't subscribed to the channel, so hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Hey, what Pokemon are you? Welcome to everyone watching. As you may have seen, James and I have done a couple of these metagame recaps here at the Beastcoast Pokemon channel. So if this is content that you enjoy and want to see more of, please let us know down in the comment section below and let us know how we can improve these videos, as we are still trying out all kinds of content here at Beastcoast Pokemon. But yeah, let's talk about the meta. There have been some big tournaments that have taken place recently leading up to the Frankfurt European International Champion. And the, EUIC is one of the two major internationals that's taking place this year. So first of all, there was a regionals in Taiwan that took place a couple of weekends ago. And, no surprise, the team that won that tournament was the team that has been dominating all around right now, which is now dubbed Rinya Sun, which is Zacian, Groudon, Instinct, Gastro, Charizard, and Grimmsnarl. So once again, I mean, this has really won 3 regional championships already this year, James. And do you think it is just that powerful? And do you think it's still the team to beat going into EUIC?
I think it's still a pretty strong and consistent team. I think it really comes down to players, because I think it's the same thing where we've seen like these really teams that do well in the format consistently. We've had it in previous years, like 2015, we've seen Chalk do really well, which was like Kangaskhan, Amoonguss, Cresselia, Heatran, Thundurus, Landorus. And like the big 6 we saw with like Xerneas, Smeargle, Kangaskhan, Salamence, Groudon back in the day. And I think it's just a team that's pretty consistent, that does well in multiple matchups, and has a lot of tools that make it really flexible and allows the player to really customize it. Because for instance, the one that won this tournament, it had a few different variations compared to the ones we normally see. Like the one that Children used to win Salt Lake City was that Charty Berry set with Charizard with the Ancient Power for the mirror. And the Charizard on this team that won this regional was actually a double fire type attack, Heatwave, Blast Burn with Lumberry on this Charizard. It also had Rock Tomb and Shadow Claw on the Groudon, compared to like Stone Edge and Heavy Slam that we've seen for the Max Steel Spike boost. The Grimmsnarl is completely different, actually. A Foul Play, Taunt, Trick, and Thunder Wave. No screens with an Iron Ball, so plays very differently, but it allows you to get like a trick for some speed control, as well as a way for Groudon to really be able to hit those flying types for Max Quake, which is really threatening. And it's just really interesting to see like the different adjustments we see on these teams and how players can really customize it towards the way they like to play the game.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's so many different variants running around at the moment. I actually saw that Japanese player actually won the last, or not won, but I guess finished first in the last ranked season. And they had like Burning Jealousy, I think, on both Grimmsnarl and Incineroar. So there are a lot of small modifications that you can do either move-wise or item-wise. Grimmsnarl and Charizard are the big ones to pay attention to for what item they're running. I think Gastrodon running Rindo Berry is something that's also popped up recently. And so it continues to just be a really good team. And I think that one of the things about this team, it's not like any player can just pick it up and use it well, but under the hands of a really good player, they have a lot of tools at their disposal. And it generally has just like favorable or neutral matchups against a lot of the teams that you're going to run into in the format, including a lot of the more, I would say, random restricted cores that you probably haven't, gone out of your way to practice for. So I think players are going to work really hard to counter this team for EUIC, but the thing is, can you come up with a team that not only has a good matchup against this, but also doesn't lose against all the other common restricted pairs that are going to be popular at the tournament, right? Like, and looking at the top 8 from this tournament specifically, there's actually a lot of diversity, like a lot of restricted pairs I wouldn't have expected, like Calyrex plus Dialga with an Azumarill, which is really cool, Groudon plus Reshiram, and then a bunch of Palkia, Calyrex, Ice Rider teams, which, I think you and I had talked about in a preview video previously, where we're kind of surprised by how it underperformed at some of the regionals in the US and Europe, but it's impressive to see, it's still clearly a decent archetype. It's just maybe a little bit tougher to execute than we initially thought.
Yeah, I think the usage for both of those restrictions have gone significantly down. However, still very powerful in the right tools, and we've definitely seen a bit more of adjustments lately. Tapu Fini has been a Pokemon, and it's gotten second at this regional, which specifically is to help out the Palkia which you bring the Misty Terrain to help prevent the Palkia from taking super effective damage from Dragon type moves. Of course, your Spatial Rend or your Max Dragon is going to be weaker. However, you do have quite a bit here where you have like Heal Pulse to help out your restricted. It's really nice because in order to set up Trick Room, your restricted tend to take a lot of damage, especially from like powerful spread moves like Water Spout from Kyogre, for instance. So the tech on top of Feeny here is really nice with the Heal Pulse, and a lot of these Palkia, Calyx, Ice Fire teams I feel like have been running Tapu Fini recently. They also have been running another Trick Room Mon, potentially like the third Trick Room Mon. We've seen Dusclops, and Porygon 2 has definitely been a thing, and Porygon 2 very, very helpful for against Calyrex, Shadow Rider, which can be really difficult for these things to handle. And then it really just comes down to like what techs that the player likes, because we see Indeedee Redirection, we see Incineroar and Amoonguss, where the Amoonguss we've seen on this one, but they just carry so many different items at times, where like the Focus Sash is like a guessing game. Is it going to be on the Indeedee? Is it going to be on the Amoonguss? Sometimes it's even on the Incineroar, for instance, so they can guarantee Parting Shot off against Kyogre. It's just really interesting to see. I think it's another pretty solid team. However, this one you have to work a little bit harder, and the techs really, I think, affect on how you want to set up for the Trick Room here in this kind of case.
Yeah, definitely. I think looking at the regionals from Taiwan, there are also a couple of interesting sets that weren't really on my radar beforehand. In third place, there's actually an Azumarill with Assault Vest with Liquidation, Aqua Jet, Steel Roller, and Play Rough. So I think Azumarill definitely an intriguing pick, one in which I just haven't seen at all. And that team also has some cool options like Life Orb, Sheer Force, Landorus, and Incarnate Form. I think that in particular is a unique option to deal with Charizard, for example, especially with Calyrex Shadow Rider, being able to cancel out Charty Berries and then just go for a Stone Edge, or even Dynamaxing Landorus and going for a Max Rockfall to just one-shot Charizard and outspeed it, I think is really appealing. There's also a Safety Goggles on Dialga here, so improves your Amoonguss matchup specifically, and also allows you to attack more comfortably in front of something like Venusaur, for example. But I think the Azumarill definitely caught my eye, and it's not a Pokemon I've actually really run into, so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I've actually played around with this team. It's actually public, and it was pretty fun. I'd imagine it was mainly for facing Yveltal, because Dialga and Calyx both kind of struggle against Yveltal. Yveltal does a ton of damage and can't really damage it, especially after like a stall, if it's going to be one of the bulkier Yveltals. So Azumarill on this team was actually really solid in order to dish out damage to Yveltal, which the team can kind of struggle with sometimes, especially because like Eliki, even though it's a pretty decent option against Yveltal, if you're able to stall out the max, the Sucker Punch really does direct enrage Eliki. So Azumarill really a good option there. Landorus Eye was also a really cool option. As you mentioned before, the Nerve with Calyx is a pairing for the Landorus to hit the Charizard with Stone Edge, and also even just the Incineroars that run Sugar Berry on the standard Rinnia Sun team. It's a really strong option, does a ton of damage. Grass now for the Gastrodon, which is pretty powerful, as most of the teams, especially with Intimidate support, can't really damage the Landorus without the Gastrodon specifically. So it's a really good tech, I think, for the Rinnia Sun teams especially.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one other Pokemon that caught my eye here, and by the way, this top 8 once again is just really cool to look at, right? Because there's actually so many different restricted duos: Zacian Groudon, Calyrex Palkia, Dialga Calyrex, Yveltal Zacian, Reshiram Groudon, Solgaleo Kyogre. And I think you and I, when we looked at the results from Salt Lake City regionals, had also pointed out, you had pointed out that I think there were like 6 different restricted cores in the top 8. So once again, goes to show like there's actually a lot of flexibility in the restricteds that you can use in this format. And the Reshiram caught my eye in particular here, as it was a Life Orb set with Blue Flare, Draco Meteor, Earth Power, and Protect with Life Orb. So paired with Groudon, you can take fire type attacks really well. So it actually matches up decently well into a fair amount of the Pokemon in the Rinnia Sun team. And having tried out Reshiram myself, it's a really huge, I feel like, a late game monster. If you're able to stall out your opponent's Dynamax, this thing in Sun will just like demolish everything. But getting there is the tough part often.
Yeah, it definitely had quite a few techs, like the U-turn on the Defiant Thunders and Quick Claw Gastrodon, which is something I don't know if you would really expect. Trick Room on the Whimsicott as well would Protect. There were definitely a lot of tools, but yeah, Reshiram we have seen a little bit kind of pop up recently, especially since we saw the top 30 on the Battle Stadium ladder of the last season. We did see an Assault Vest Reshiram, so it's a pretty interesting Pokemon. It's able to really bulk out, dish out a lot of damage under the sun, especially with this Life Orb variant here. And yeah, it's definitely cool to see like other restrictors just being built upon and seeing how they can be put on a new spin, especially to take on more of the common teams like the Rinnia Sun team that you've mentioned before.
Yeah, speaking of that, let's actually take a look at the results from a online tournament organized by Victory Road. This was just an online grassroots event, which by the way, it had 413 players, which I don't know about you, James, but I'm really impressed by that for like an online grassroots event for restricted format right before EUIC. Like, I think restricted formats generally just see less players, at least in previous generations. And so to me, it's actually really exciting to see so many people come up and even like play in this tournament. So, you know, props to Victory Road and GG Tour, the organizer that they worked with. And I think that's just awesome before we even get, you know, dive into the actual teams.
Yeah, this team definitely interesting, and Victory Road does host some amazing online VGC tournaments. The first one they did for Series 12, I think, had over 500 players, and it's just awesome to continue to see like amazing numbers showcasing, especially for this kind of tournament right before EUIC where everyone wants to get to practice. But yeah, there's quite a interesting top cut here. This was an X2 cut actually for this event, and there were definitely a lot of interesting teams. And a fun fact about this tournament, Rinya, the creator of the Sun team, the famous Sun team, actually did qualify and get 9th place at this event. So, and the player he lost to actually was running the exact same mirror. So it's just really interesting to see. Like, I think they all had different adjustments on their team. So it's just really cool to see like the interaction, because even though it's like a standard mirror, like the item and the move choices can be such a big difference, I think, in this specific team matchup.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the teams in the top 8 of this tournament were generally like a lot more standard. I think first of all, the winning team is actually pretty cool, right? It featured Energy Ball on Calyrex Shadow Rider next to Gigantamax Wakamberry Blastoise, and it was physical AV Regieleki as well. So the idea is that, you know, normally your answer against Blastoise with Brynja's team and variants of that Sun team is to switch in Gastrodon, but Calyrex Shadow Rider can just Energy Ball Gastrodons as they come in and just demolish them, and then that clears the way for Blastoise to just go for its G-Max attack. I think we've seen Regielekis, a lot of players running offensive Regieleki in really different sets, whether it be physical AV or special, you know, just standard Focus Sash, and, you know, Life Orb or Magnet, for example. So Lecky continues to be, you know, a really flexible Pokemon. And then in 3rd place, a player called Carlos used a really interesting team featuring Weezing and Kyogre. I think a lot of people have been talking about Weezing and Kyogre as a way to potentially counter Rinya Sun, but, you know, it's not exactly the easiest kind of team to execute, and definitely not the easiest core to execute. And that team, which is public, by the way, has a lot of cool things like, I think, Choice Specs, Calyrex Shadow Rider, and Choice Scarf on the Kyogre as well. So I think, you know, Weezing and Kyogre is not an archetype that I expect many players to use going into EUIC, but it is one of those teams that, you know, can have a very favorable matchup into what is still the most popular team at the moment.
Yeah, it has a good matchup against Rinya's Sun because of the Weezing being able to shut down the Storm Drain on the Gastrodon, allowing your Kyogre to dish out a lot of damage with its Water Spout, and of course being able to shut down Solar Power Zacian, not getting its Blade from the attack boost. It's really a powerful option against that specific team, but it does come with where there's risks and rewards. This is a team that really, with Weezing Regigigas, calling the Weezing attack, you have to call whether they're targeting into the Regigigas slot or the Weezing slot a lot of the time, and if you do get that wrong, it could be really punishing. If you lose to Weezing, of course, Regigigas with the slow start, wasting a max usually, because he will probably be maxing Regigigas in a lot of cases, it will be very hurtful. And yeah, this team very fragile. It does have a Scarf Kyogre and a Specs Calyrex, so you could easily lose resources, but if you are able to set up right positions and get the reads right, it's a really rewarding team in that kind of case. It was definitely interesting to see a safety goggles on the Eleki as well, with just all these, specifically the wide guard on the Regigigas, because even after Dynamax, you have a way to block the ground on Precipice Blades. It's a pretty strong option right there. And then you kind of see like some really interesting versions of like previous teams, like for instance Zacian Yveltal, which we don't really see too much. We've seen like a few pop up here and there, but in 4th place we actually see a version kind of like the Calyrex Shadow Rider Zacian teams we see, but it has Yveltal instead of the Calyrex Shadow Rider, and then Rotom Heat, which is just an interesting pick. The Yveltal was actually kind of a crazy set where it was, I believe it was Safety Goggles Taunt on this Yveltal with Snow and Oblivion Wing. So
I didn't even know that. Wow.
Yeah, it's definitely one heck of an interesting set right there. And yeah, I mean, there's also like probably a few other tricks. I don't remember every single Rinya's Sun team, but there were VODs from this tournament, which we'll link down below if anyone wants to watch the games of it. But I think there were definitely a few adjustments. I think one of the players ran Burn Jealousy. I think it was Antonio that ran Burning Jealousy on the Incineroar. We've been seeing that rise a bit more often. And yeah, then we have like the Zacian Ogre team, the highest placement one was with Landers variant and Rillaboom, which you see like maybe Rillaboom for sure, Landers on others, but combined together is an interesting choice here. And then Brady also running a very similar team to Francesco, who did win this event, but Thunderous over to Reggie Eliki.
Yeah, I think like this tournament feels like a pretty good picture of what I actually expect a lot of players to be bringing to EUIC. A couple of things to note for a big, internationals like EUIC is that, first of all, there aren't that many events this year, so players who want to qualify for the World Championships will, want to use a team that will allow them to get championship points for Worlds, right? And as of right now, I think there's about 300 players registered, and you need to get top 64 in order to finish, the day with championship points. And so I do expect a lot of players to maybe just go with more conservative teams that are proven to be steady and don't have any really crazy surprises in terms of Pokemon choice. But I think, you'll see a lot of small deviations in terms of movesets that can give players an advantage, like Burning Jealousy, which you and I have talked about a little bit, either on Pokemon like Incineroar or Grimmsnarl, for example, and just using like a couple surprise items or moves rather than just, completely reinvent the wheel and figure out completely new Pokemon, right? And so I think going into this event, a lot of the teams that I see in the top 8 here should be popular picks for EUIC. 3 Rinya Sun teams in top 8, right? Like this archetype is still just really common, and a lot of players are going to opt to use it. Kyogre Zacian still dominant. I think Calyrex and Zacian is a duo that has been strong. Actually hasn't done like super well, I think, in some of the previous regionals, but there were 2 in the top 8, as you mentioned here, also winning the event. And so I think that's picking up some steam, like a little bit more aggressive hyper offense. But overall, yeah, like what do you think the meta is going to look like going into EUIC, and what are your expectations for it?
I think we're just going to see a bunch of things. We're going to see meta picks, and then we're going to see like some interesting restricted duos. I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of combinations. We're definitely going to see Groudon Zacian, Kyogre Zacian for sure. Calyrex Zacian is going to be very common. I think we're just going to see a lot of Zacians at the end of the day, because I think we could see that Zacian is pretty much a bold
statement, James.
one of the strongest restricteds out there. But then we'll just see a few duos that'll be reinvented that have to play a bit harder, probably. Like we did see that Carlos did not have a Zacian after all, and had a really unique, interesting pairs of Pokemon right here. And I think it's just really going to come down to how well can players prep their restricted duo and their team in general to handle like all these matchups that they could possibly face, because there's a really wide diversity of Pokemon that we see in just the top 34 cut here specifically. Like there's a lot of restricted pairs. Like we see Xerneas Groudon, we see Zekrom Kyogre, we see Lunala Groudon, Dialga plus Zacian, which has been falling off but it's still a thing, Ho plus Groudon. And yeah, it's just like you have to prepare for all these restricteds, because yeah, sure, you could just hope to prepare against like maybe like the top 8 or top 10 most restricted duos, but you also got to have matchups, because I mean, this is a big international. There's over probably 400 players that are going to be competing at the end of the day. You don't know what everyone's going to run, so just having game plans for that. And I think we're just going to see like what players are most comfortable with.
Definitely. I think one other thing that's interesting is, I don't know about you, but I feel like Venusaur is a Pokemon. Obviously, it's been super good for a long time, but I actually didn't see too much of it in early Series 12. And in Europe specifically, like it caught my eye because there were 2 Venusaur teams in the top 8 of the Liverpool regionals, which took place a couple of weekends ago. One was on this team with Yveltal and Groudon featuring Bronzong, and the other one was on a team with Lunala and Groudon featuring Venusaur. And then it was also actually in 9th place. This one didn't even have Sun. It was just Zacian Kyogre with Venusaur as a potential answer into opposing Sun teams. So at least for me, that's like a Pokemon that's caught my eye a little bit more, and I feel like players are going back to using Venusaur, but there's a lot of different ways you can, build around it, right? You can use Torkoal. For example, Binjie Wang, who finished in the top 30 of the last ranked season, had a Xerneas Venusaur Torkoal team, which was really interesting. So just a Pokemon that I feel like players kind of stopped using for a little bit, and now it's really come back in popularity. But I don't know if that's just, personal observation. I just like missed out on the Venusaur wave in the first few weeks of the season.
Yeah, Venusaur was a Pokemon that basically players was using because Chlorophyll Sleep Powder, good max move up, of course. It's still a really strong option. However, then I think it kind of just started falling off more and more, because we saw like, again, we saw the rise of Charizard, Calyx Ice Rider teams were pretty difficult for Venusaur Groudon teams to handle specifically, but I do think it's a pretty strong Pokemon with options to max and not max. You have a bunch of mind games with like switching Groudon, getting the sleep powder off. There's just like quite a few combinations you can do with Venusaur. I think there's like quite a few Pokemon that are like that, where for instance we saw the Rotom Heat from Kaido. I think there's like a few Pokemon that definitely are being a little bit slept on, but maybe we'll see a resurgence of them at EUIC, because there's like a few niche picks, right? Because it really just depends on what you need it for on the team. Rotom Heat's decently well against the, I guess, the Sun team. Of course, if you have Wisp and maybe like Nasty Plot, you could threaten quite a bit. You could threaten the Charizard. You still take a lot of damage though from Wildfire, but it really just depends, I think, because we're going to see these teams. I think what you mentioned before, we're going to see like the item choices, the move slots, they're going to be a little bit more custom. I think maybe players will explore a little bit more, but you also have these like 1 or 2 niche Pokemon that will fit on a team, and I think really redefine how that team is played.
That all makes a lot of sense. So before we finish off, James, I want to ask some rapid fire questions and get your quick input and all for my opinions as well. So first of all, what do you think are kind of those, niche picks that you just mentioned that you think may not be super popular, but can be strong enough to counter a good chunk of the metagame and maybe even win the event?
Ooh, that is a tough one. I was actually testing Weezing a month ago because I was considering going to EUIC, and I was actually running a very similar team to Carlos. It's, I think, a really strong option there. I think Regieleki is actually still very slept on, even though like we've seen a few Regielekis in cut. I do think that is very underrepresented for like how crazy Regieleki can be. It is not that great in the Sun matchup, but I think it's so strong into every other matchup basically, where it's actually just, I still think it's insane how low the usage is. There's maybe like a few niche picks here and there that I could definitely see. Restricted wise, I could see players opting to go for Zygarde if they want to go for Zygarde. It's a Pokemon that probably can do decently well against Rinya Sun, but I don't know how well it would do otherwise. But maybe we'll see a reinvention of a bulky Zygarde team that could do really well. And then I don't know, there's like just, I think there's so much. There's Aerodactyl, actually I've had a fun time with in a game recently, where Unnerve with like the ability to hit Charizard Airstream is pretty strong. It was actually pretty fun. Entei is an option I think that players can consider. I mean, there's just so many Pokemon, right? It really just depends on what kind of team we're talking about and what the roles are. I think there's like so many strong Pokemon that people are sleeping on. Thunderous Fairing could be like another good pick because it's able to dish out a lot of damage, has grass knot coverage for Gastrodon. It really just depends.
Yeah, for sure. I think like I'm intrigued by some people talking, Indy plus Landorus T isn't really anything new, but it's a team that can at least scare off a lot of the early pressure from the Sun team that exists at the moment. I think Manual Rain Dance is really interesting. I don't know if players will really run it, but I was thinking Manual Rain Dance with Tornadus, or even Sable. I mean, Sable is one of those Pokemon where I always like hate going up against, but every time I tried, I'm like, I'm so bad. Like I just can't get it to work, because it's like the classic syndrome where maybe it provides some support, but then all you're doing is you're going for quash or maybe a foul play. But under the right team or under the right player, I think it can be really interesting. I am very interested in Weezing because I think everyone's like talked about this Pokemon since the Sun team has popped up, but I still think it's really hard to use, and especially for a tournament like a UIC, I'm curious if people really like risk bringing a composition like that. I think generally is more difficult to execute. One thing that's interesting as well is, like Screens has existed for obviously a long time throughout Sword and Shield, and I feel like Brick Break is still kind of like underutilized as an attack. So I'm curious if like players try to tick that into their move pools a little bit more, because I know when I go up against Rinya Sun, it's just such a nightmare if you actually let them get both screens up, because it's just so much less damage you're doing throughout the course of the game.
Yeah, a lot more Thunderuses have been picking up Brick Break. I think, for instance, in the VR tournament, I believe Brady was Brick Break on his Thundurus. And I think it's definitely something we can see. It can definitely be, I think, a move that could fit on to, like, I believe Rillaboom gets it, Incineroar gets it. I do think it could technically be teched in certain matchups. And yeah, I mean, other Pokemon I was actually considering because of the Rinya matchup, I think Garchomp and Landorus Eye are actually pretty underrated. They're a little bit difficult to handle, but I do think we saw how in the Taichung regionals, the Landorus Eye with Calyx was a really cool pairing, and you have Landorus Eye. That's one benefit compared to Landorus T. Even though Landorus T has Intimidate, you're actually faster than Charizard naturally, which is really strong. I think Garchomp also has a pretty strong matchup against Rinya Sun. You do have to be cautious of like Zacian and the Gastrodon, but otherwise you don't really take that much damage. Swords Dance is a threat. Rockfall against Charizard is always scary to play against. And I do think that it does have a place right now, as it can do a lot of damage and it's pretty bulky right now for what we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess final two questions. First one is, what kind of not super popular restricted Pokemon do you think can have a big impact on this event? And then the final one is, what's your prediction for the restricted duel that will win the event?
Ooh, okay. What would I say is probably the underdog restricted. I still think Dialga is decently okay for this. I think Yveltal's still really strong in this right now. I think it's actually a really good pick for EUIC, and one I would definitely consider if I was going. I think it has a lot of power. Other restricteds, I would mainly just say I think a lot of my money would be on Yveltal, especially maybe Calyx Shadow Rider in a different sort of fashion, like the offensive one we saw from Carlos. I definitely could see more, but of course the bulky version with just Wisp support, Summer and Snarl is also a really strong option. I think Kyurem White can make a breakout potentially. I think Rayquaza could be a Pokemon that makes it into the day 2 potentially, as I think it has some pretty strong matchups. We see Xerneas as a sleeper, and it could definitely be a threat. I don't know. I think we have a lot of restricteds that can just do well, especially right now during the period. I just wouldn't know if I would say they would win the event, but I could definitely see them like squeaking into day 2, for instance.
For sure. That's how I feel too. I think like the list that I have is Solgaleo, which, I had used in Salt Lake, and I still think is very underexplored relative to some of the other restricteds. Like, yeah, there's the weakness policy set, but I've seen like AV plus coaching, which I think is pretty cool. A lot of different ways that you can run it. Necrozma Duskmane, Dialga, Reshiram, Lunala, Xerneas are all ones that, have already had decent performances here and there. Maybe a single top 8 or a single top 16, but they're all Pokemon that I think, are waiting to get a deep performance after already, proving their strengths at like the more regional level, right? And so I think all those are viable, but the thing is that if you're using these Pokemon, they're definitely a little bit more difficult to execute. So for me personally, like I expect one of Zacian Groudon, Zacian Kyogre, or Zacian Calyrex to likely win the event. If I had to bet, like those are the 3 pairs that are, the most obvious answers that I think would be safer picks, but I'm curious if you agree with that.
I would say they would do well. I do think we're going to see all 3 of those in the top cut. Zacian Kyogre, I'm actually a little bit skeptical right now. I think it needs to be a really good overall team, because I think some builds of Zacian Kyogre kind of focus on certain matchups more than other and leave some behind. So it's really going to have to be a pretty good balance, I think, with the remaining partners, especially that because of all the Rinya Suns, you're going to need some specific techs to handle it, because it can be a little bit difficult, especially like dealing with Gastrodon, and just some of the answers against Gastrodon can be a bit weak to Charizard, so really have to tech on certain stuff. Again, I think the manual Rain Dance is a pretty strong option as well on the Tornadus. I think it really does help out the matchup. For other restricted pairs, I would say I would be betting on, personally, I think Calyx Shadow Rider is still really strong in this format. I wouldn't be surprised to see Calyx Shadow Rider or Zacian personally, as I think Yveltal plus Zacian is also like a really strong core as of the moment, and I think it's a really good matchup spread against a lot of things you would commonly see at EUIC going up, so I wouldn't be surprised if that takes it home. Like those I would say would probably be the confident ones. Zacian Groudon is an interesting one where I'm actually surprised. I think it's going to be like really matchup prepped a lot, and it's just going to be a thing of, can it actually take home the event, or are players actually going to be prepped well enough to handle like all these different variants that we've been seeing pop off? And I feel like that's going to be a big question, where I think the team can do it. I just feel like it's going to have a lot tougher of a time compared to like all the regionals where players might have had some sort of game plan, but I think everyone now knows, after seeing like how well it's been doing, you need a game plan, and you have to have a consistent matchup flow against it.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree with all of that. And I guess, I keep saying one last thing, but the final thing is kind of just talking about the list of players that are attending this event. I think most of the top European players will be there. A couple of American players are going over. I'm actually attending it as well, but more so, yeah, like I haven't put in too much time prepping for this one, unfortunately. So we'll see how it goes. But either way, I think definitely a deep hole, and I think Europe is just so strong as a region. So I'm eager to see who really takes it out on top.
Yeah, especially because this is going to be pretty important, and I'm kind of curious because compared to previous international championships, I wonder how much of the foreign scene, not like just Europe and US, which some are going. I'm actually curious on how many players from the Oceania region and the Latam region are actually going to this event, especially with like the player cap. I'm actually curious on how many actually got in to register. So I'm pretty interested to see. This will definitely be quite a unique one. We have like multiple, and I mean multiple, international champions going to this event. We have Pado, who was the 2019 one, going to defend his title. We have Ashton Cox, who won 2 internets. In Latam, we have Jeremy Rodriguez who won an internet. Wolf, who's going, of course, I think a lot of players know. You're going. There's just a lot of, I think this is a very stacked event, and I think EUIC is one of the hardest events of the year for sure. And yeah, I'm excited to see who is going to take it out on top.
Absolutely. So that's going to conclude our general overview of the metagame from the last couple of weeks, and also our preview for the European International Championships, which is taking place this weekend. So let us know down in the comment section below what you expect to win. Let us know what restricted duo you think you'll see, expect to see taking it home. And yeah, thank you so much for watching as always. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you all next time.